So if you asked any car enthusiast to name the top driving cars of all time, you'd get names like the Mazda MX-5, the Porsche Boxster, and of course the Lotus Elise, which is why I've bought one. But the Elise is a bit different from a normal sports car like the Toyota 86, and in this video I'm going to be explaining what I've learned about driving the Elise on track as opposed to the 86. So the Elise is a very different design to the Toyota 86, so let's take a look at how some of those differences translate into different driving techniques. So you can see the first difference is the Elise is smaller and lighter. It weighs under 900 kilograms, whereas the 86 is around 1250 kilograms. Now, aside from that, the biggest difference between the two is the location of the engine. In the case of the Elise, it's what we termed a mid-engine car because the engine's where I'm pointing now, just pretty much over and just ahead of the rear axle, whereas in the 86, the engine's here, pretty much just behind the front axle. Now, that's a significant difference when you're driving because the engine is the heaviest part of the car, and having a mass at the back here makes the car handle very differently compared to that same heavy mass right at the front of the car. So you may have heard this myth that car makers like to say, oh, the perfect weight distribution is 50% at the front, 50% at the rear. It's not true, never will be true, never has been true. Now, in the case of the Elise, you've only got 38% or so of the weight on the front axle and over 60% on the rear axle, and the centre of gravity is this point here, and you know that because that's where one of the jacking points is. Now, the interesting thing about that is it's quite a long way from the front axle to the centre of gravity here relative from the centre of gravity to the rear axle. So that is definitely something you've got to take in mind when you are driving the car, because it means some quite different driving characteristics to vehicles like the 86. Now, the 86's weight distribution is about 53% on the front axle and just under 50% on the rear axle, and its centre of gravity, I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it's round about here. It's actually far more midpoint than the Elise, and also it's got a longer wheelbase as well, and again that means that there's different driving techniques on the 86 versus the Elise. At the back, the Elise has what we term an open differential, so it's not limited slip, there's nothing like that, it doesn't even have brake traction control, it's just a plain old open differential. By contrast, the 86 does have a limited slip or LSD differential in the back, and that's a torsion unit or torque sensing. Basically, as one wheel starts to spin, then instead of just spinning freely like with an open differential, torque will get sent more to the opposite wheel which isn't spinning, and that gives the car better traction out of corners. It also means that the car is more tail happy under power, and the back end is more likely to come out into oversteer. Now, the Elise also has a shorter wheelbase, which is the distance from front to rear hubs, than the 86 does, so that means it's a little bit more agile and manoeuvrable. So a quick look at the dynamics of a mid-engine car. We're going to start with this car. It's got four-wheel steer, and it's going around a large circle, and it's got 50% of the weight on the back and 50% of weight on the front exactly, and therefore the centre of gravity is right in the middle. So what happens then is the centripetal force, which is the force pushing it outside, is exactly the same on the front as on the back, so that car will start to neutral steer. The faster it goes, it will just sort of describe a wider circle, so those tyres will slip under extra force exactly the same rate as the ones on the front. There's absolutely no difference there because that weight is exactly the same front and rear. Now, if we go for a rear biased vehicle, if we're going to put 70% over the weight of the back of the car and 30% on the front, that changes the equation because we've got more weight over the back of the wheel, so we're going to get more force trying to push the back of the car out versus the front of the car out, and the car will now attempt to oversteer, and that's basically what the Lotus is. So how is that fixed? Well, you can take a look here. The tyres on the front versus the back. Well, the back tyres are a taller diameter and they are also wider. Now, taller and wider tyres do grip better on road and track, so therefore there's more grip on the back than the front, and then that is how the Lotus's natural tendency, if it had a square layout plus some wheel alignment, etc., is basically designed out from oversteer. So there's basically more grip at the rear to counter oversteer. Now at the front, the tyres are really small, 175 55 16, overall diameter of 600 millimeters, 23.6 inches, and width 175. At the rear, they're 5% taller, 634 overall diameter, width 225, which is 30% wider, so a fair bit more grip at the back. Now, you know, now we call that a staggered layout when the tyres on the front are smaller than the tyres at the rear, and they're normally smaller in width as well as diameter. All right, now let's talk about load transfer, comparing the 86 to the Lotus as well, under braking and acceleration. So statically, the 86 is about 50-50, the Elise is about 68-32, and when we accelerate we get a load transfer to the back, so the 86 gets quite a bit of extra weight on the front, still on the back, still quite a bit on the front. The Lotus gets much less weight on the front and there's a lot of weight on the back, so therefore it's unlikely to break traction compared to the 86 because you've got even more weight on the back there, and obviously that open differential reduces the chance of breaking traction as well. And part of the reason Lotus is running open differential is because there's so much weight on the track on the back that they're unlikely to do so. Now braking is the opposite. The interesting thing here is that when you brake, you've already got a fair bit of weight on the front, so the back gets fairly light quickly, but you've got the centre of gravity quite a long way forwards here, so the car's quite stable. It's a bit like a dart, so you're not necessarily going to get the back of the car too loose. Now with the Lotus you brake hard, and you can see that by braking quite hard you actually brake at about 0.7 G, and that gets you to about the same weight distribution as the 86, except the 86 does it statically by weight distribution. Here you're doing it by load distribution because you're not actually moving weight, you're just transferring load onto the front. It's got the same effect of pressing the tyres down for more grip. Now this makes the Lotus very stable under braking compared to the 86, unless you brake really hard and start to loosen that rear end, and then what happens, because the centre of gravity is quite a long way back, that's quite a long pivot point from about here to there, and that can make the car unstable under braking, but it can also help you rotate it into the corner easier than the 86 can, and certainly under hard braking as well. So there's a driving difference between the two. Now, how quick is the Lotus in a straight line? Well, it's a light car with a relatively powerful engine, so under 900 kilograms, 162 kilowatts of power, 6-speed manual. Now the 0 to 100 time is around 4.2 seconds, I think, if you abuse the clutch. So what that means is it will accelerate very quickly, but because there's not a huge amount of power, the top speed isn't going to be that great, because once you start getting above maybe 120, 150 kilometers an hour, you really find that cars like this tend to tail off relative to perhaps slower accelerating cars which are more powerful, because the faster you go, your speed is more about your total power than power to weight, and this has got a great power to weight ratio but not much total power. Because the Lotus is very lightweight, it doesn't have a lot of body roll in corners, so you don't need a really stiff suspension. What you can do is run a softer suspension, and that means that you can ride the curbs more easily, and that leads to a greater arc through the corners and a quicker lap time. Now both cars are rear wheel drive and they are both manuals, and what that means is that if you get your gear changes wrong, you can do something called compression lock the vehicle, and that means go into a low gear, let's say second, at a high speed, and actually cause the back wheels to lose traction, and in that case you're likely to spin. So because they're rear drive vehicles particularly, you really want to master the art of heel and toe downshifting, which is where you brake hard whilst at the same time blipping the throttle so you can change gear smoothly without going into that compression lock-up situation. And it's critical for both vehicles, and you really want it for front wheel drive vehicles as well, but you're less likely to lock the rear wheels on a front wheel drive car because obviously they're not being driven and there's a lot of weight over the front wheels already, so you're unlikely to lock those front wheels either. And even if you did, it would just be understeer as opposed to locking the back wheels whilst you're turning, and well, you'd better be good at oversteer recovery if you do that. Okay, so we've got here a car with an open differential and a lot of weight over the back, and we've got here a car with a Torsen differential limited slip and less weight at the back. Now what that means is when you accelerate out of a corner, you've obviously got a weight shift to the back anyway, so you've got a lot of grip on the back of the Lotus, which means in a car like this you're less likely to get power on oversteer than in a car like this, and particularly because this has the Torsen LSD, it can get a little bit tail happy. I've not found this in the case of the Elise. Now if I had a more powerful Exige with a limited slip diff, that would probably be the case, but really that's not oversteer coming out of a corner isn't a concern, whereas with the 86 it can be. What this does mean is that with the 86 you can power out of a corner and actually use the power to rotate the car and complete the rotation of the car coming out of the corner. So 86 versus Elise driving line. So we're going to start with the 86 first. So we do a brake, a turn in, take a late apex and power out. That's what I do in the 86. With the Elise, fairly similar. I brake later because the car's lighter and also it can brake later. I'd turn in a little bit later here and I would square it off a little bit more here, and the reason for that, because it can turn tighter, I can use that rotation better to get the car around, but also I'm not going to be able to use the car's power to really oversteer and get the car back in the car around the corner in the same way that I can with the 86, and the Lotus is likely to understeer a little bit under power compared to the 86, so I actually need to take this sharper line here and then be prepared for a bit more understeer than I'd have with the 86 on exit. Now the differences there are quite small, but they do exist, and once you get into it with those two cars you do start to notice the differences. So in summary, both cars are amazing track cars and I love driving both of them, but the Elise just offers that extra depth of richness and driver challenge, which is why I love it so much. And the differences between the two, and these are subtle differences, they're not major ones. So with the Elise you brake later, brake harder, really get the weight over the nose so it will grip and turn in, square off the corner a little bit more, and so that you can deal with the little tendency it has to understeer under power. And with the 86 it's basically the reverse of that. You have to brake a little bit earlier, you have to you can't brake quite as much, you do need to trail brake though, but coming out of corner exit you don't have to deal with understeer. In fact you can actually rotate the car a little bit with the power in order just to complete that corner, the opposite to the Elise. And in both vehicles definitely learn how to heel and toe. So I hope you found this video useful. Any questions please drop them in the comments, and thanks for watching.